To the online portion of GDM240. Today we are covering our first chapter. We're getting in and actually starting out with an online class. So hopefully you guys enjoy it. Again, if there are any things that you think we could do differently, that you would enjoy better, then go ahead and send me an email, send me a text, let me know so that we can start to structure these as we go along. This is a bit of an experimental kind of format for the class. So let me know what you guys think. All right, let's hop right in. Hopefully you have something that you're able to take notes with. If you're listening in your car, hopefully you can go back and look at some notes, or sorry, look again and take some notes on the content that we're going to be covering. So let's hop right in. So the first thing that is kind of an overarching idea about this class is that we're really going to be looking at visual communication, how we communicate visually as opposed to speech, as opposed to auditorily or vocally. So the main point, one of the main points that we need to know, and it's going to be on your quiz, is this phrase that writing is the visual counterpart of speech. So writing is the visual counterpart of speech. What that means is we can tell a story, but we can't see a story. And so writing is basically a way that if we hear a story, we can write it down and present that visually. Writing and speech are really the two first kinds of communication that we know about that were developed by early man. We needed ways to tell stories, to say what was going on in everyday life, and speech and writing were the two ways that kind of came to the forefront. So we're going to start out talking about the prehistoric visual. So this is way back in the day, going back to Paleolithic days. That's kind of caveman era. And although they didn't have alphabets and letters like we do now, they still needed to convey information. They still needed to tell stories. And they didn't use letters to do that like we do. They wanted to use images to communicate ideas, to keep records, to kind of transmit information. And so they used what we see here in this space. These are called petroglyphs. Now, a petroglyph is specific to being carved on rock. So a petroglyph is a scratched sign or a simple figure that has been scratched into rock. Even though we can't auditorily hear the story that they're saying, we can look and still piece together. Here it seems like there is maybe some farmland, maybe some kind of sheep, horse, kind of going out into the field. And even though we don't know the exact story, we can still piece together what was going on back then. A lot of times they would just scratch these into rocks, but other times they'd use black and white charcoal, or sometimes use colors from some yellow oxides or red oxides, as you can see here, to kind of add some color to tell that story a little bit further. That instead of being, we went out on the farm, we use these images to say there were horses on this farm. And they used the color to show there were red horses on the farm. So they did as much as they could to tell as much of the story visually as they could. So the animals that you see here are called pictographs. Now, a pictograph is an elementary picture or sketch that represents what is being depicted. So if we look at this image that we see here, let's use red. This right here would be a pictograph of an ox because it looks like an ox. This here would be a pictograph of a horse because it looks like a horse. So a pictograph is basically, if you're playing Pictionary, that's exactly what you're doing. You're drawing what the thing looks like. Pictographs were really at the very, very beginning of this idea of written communication and kind of formed our basis for writing. So as we move on, a lot of petroglyphs that were carved into wood were pictographs or even ideographs. So what that means is, as we just looked, that the pictograph that we're looking at, so a pictograph is, again, an image representing something what it looks like. So let's say that we need to tell a story, that Bobby and Johnny are going out into the field and they found a bear and they need to fight the bear. And so they'd start out with the images. So let's say that this is Jimmy and he's got a spear. So this would be a pictograph of a spear. This would be a pictograph of a man. So then there is a bear in the middle. Give him some little bear ears. Excuse me, sorry about that. Some little bear legs and a little bear tail. So let's say that this is a pictograph of a bear. Why? Because it is an image representing what a bear actually looks like. Doesn't look like a great bear, but it looks like a bear. So what happens is that these individual pictographs started to move and started to be conveyed as ideographs. So an ideograph is conveying an idea. It's using a bunch of pictographs to convey an idea. So here, this would be maybe the idea of hunting. And what happened is as they started to go along, they realized that there were things that they didn't have, that they couldn't represent visually, like the idea of violence. There was nothing that looked like violence. You couldn't draw a violence, whereas you can draw a bear or draw a man. And so they started to come up with these kind of representative symbols. And so let's say that this would be the symbol for violence that they would put in there. So what would happen is as this became a symbol for violence, and remember we talked about symbols, a symbol is something that has a meaning outside of any context. So we look at it, we look at this shape, it doesn't really mean anything to us, but it would be understood that this implied violence. And so what this scene would be showing is that there is a pictogram of a man, pictogram of a bear, pictogram of a spear, and then this symbol here that shows there is violence. So this whole image all the way around would be an ideogram of hunting. So there's a man, a bear, and violence. This whole image here would be an ideogram of hunting. So if someone wanted to represent hunting, they would use this ideogram. Now, eventually, these symbols they started to use started to break down and not be full ideas. It wasn't, you wouldn't look at the symbol and say, oh, that's the symbol that means hunting. They started to be simplified more and more and more and started to represent sounds. So let's say that this eventually started to make a sh sound. So every time they saw this, it would make a sh sound. And eventually, these forms were simplified and simplified and simplified, and this sound here eventually morphed into what we know today as a sort of letter. So this may have become sort of an S, which would make a S sound, which we'll talk about in the next couple chapters. So moving on from the Paleolithic era and kind of caveman days, we're going to move into the cradle of civilization. This is a place called Mesopotamia, moving a little forward in time. There were a group of people called the Sumerians. The Sumerians came into Mesopotamia and they had a ton of inventions and all this technology that they wanted to bring to the people. The Sumerians are really responsible for launching this area into a path of broad civilization. They created a migration from a smaller village culture to a large civilization culture. So they kind of brought in the technology from somewhere, say like Hemet, into Riverside, downtown, and built this kind of city structure. The invention of writing was one of those that they brought in, and it created a huge intellectual revolution. People wanted to know how to do more things. They wanted to be more invested in record keeping. They would use it for kind of economic uses, social uses, and really the Mesopotamians opened up this whole new bag of worms for cultural development. Because this new culture started to grow into this large civilization culture, it was something that they needed a way to track taxes, ownership, property. And what they would do is they'd create slates like this. So let's say that Johnny turned in 5 bags of wheat. So what they would do is they would take a clay tablet and they would etch in here to show 5 with a hand, and they would show that there was grains of wheat. So this would go on record, and they would have a permanent written record that would show if Johnny came back and said, "Hey, I need to get 5 barrels of wheat." He had those and had the document to back it up to prove that he had that. So really, writing came out of a need to show ownership and keep records. They would often use these in a system that they would use pictographic drawing. So as you can see here, this was probably something like grain. Sorry about that. This was probably something like grain. Here, this may have been forks. Let's say that this was styluses that they would use to press in to the clay. So they'd use this and use pictographic representations. So it looks like whatever the thing was. You would have 5 of these sticks. So as things continued and progressed, those symbols became more and more simplified. Now, in this area in Mesopotamia, there was an abundance of clay. And so they would use clay as the basic material for almost all of their record keeping. They would hold the pen, or it's called a reed, in the right hand, and then the clay in their left hand and write with it. They would write with a stylus that had a sharp point, but it was replaced eventually by one that had a triangular shaped point. And this triangular shaped point, eventually the symbols evolved into a new kind of writing called cuneiform. You'll need to know that for your quiz. And cuneiform writing is Latin for wedge shaped. So as you can see, as they would write and create these symbols, it would create these little wedge shaped indents. And so as they were more and more simplified, it became easier and easier to make little symbols that were clean and recognizable using this wedge shaped stylus in the style called cuneiform. These pictures and symbols would be represented over and over and over again, which kind of turned into what we use as letters today. As they would need to represent new ideas or spoken sounds, they would start to use more and more of these abstract symbols. If they were talking about day or night, or talking about the light or the dark, they would use these abstract symbols and come up with a system so that people could easily recognize, like we have our 26 letters of our alphabet. They had a set of symbols that would convey these ideas to them. Slowly, these symbols stopped representing actual things and were shortened and condensed down into simple sounds. So remember when we talked about our symbol for violence? Our symbol for violence was this kind of slash. So eventually, after the cuneiform and they had all these symbols, it got down to just using these symbols, and these symbols started to only represent sounds. So in theory, then this symbol here would only represent a k sound. Instead of being a full symbol of maybe this is a bouquet of flowers, it would only represent a k sound, and it would be shortened, and everyone would know what that symbol meant. So eventually, our alphabet has 26 letters. Cuneiform was simplified down to 560 different signs. So their alphabet consisted of 560 different characters that had different sounds, and it was incredibly difficult to master. People had such a hard time learning all 560 that cuneiform worked as an early kind of form of writing, but didn't really stick around very long. Eventually, the Sumerians began to mix symbols and images. So they'd start to mix, as you can see here, some of the symbols that were in this cuneiform that everyone knew what this sound was. Maybe it was a ch sound, and the sound over here was a p sound. So these symbols would be combined with images that would show more of a pictogram of exactly what was going on, and almost like an illustration of what was happening in the scene. This here at the top is the Blau Monument. This is the oldest artifact that we found that contains words and pictures on the same surface. Another use for written communication is they would use it to standardize weights and measurement. This down here is a black rock duck. And what would be on this is they would have different symbols that would represent how much this weighed. And that way they could put it next to something or weigh it with something and know that this duck weighs a certain amount because it's written on there. And then 20 bags of grain would weigh the same amount, and they'd be able to regulate and show how much grain was measured and have a kind of system for measurement. You'll need to know this for your quiz. This is the Code of Hammurabi, and it's written in cuneiform, and it is one of the earliest forms of laws by written communication. Before that, people kind of knew what not to do, what to do, what the kind of governing authorities wanted them to do. It was more of an oral understanding, and this was the first actual written communication that laid out the laws of the land. And it's called the Code of Hammurabi, Hammurabi, Code of Hammurabi. Moving right along. As village culture started to rise and kind of started to become more of that city culture, like we were talking about from Hemet to downtown Riverside, people needed a visual identification system that could show property, that could show, I own this. This is the very, very first time that we see something like this, and it's almost like a personal trademark. On the back of your computers, on the back of your phones, you probably have an Apple logo, or on your shoes you have a Nike logo. It's that same idea of putting a stamp on something that you know whose it is. When we look at this stamp here, instead of being a Nike logo, we would know that this is the stamp of John. John Smith, let's say. So John Smith lived way back then, and this was his trademark stamp. If you saw something stamped with this, you would know that the ownership belonged to John Smith. Nowadays, we have logos on everything. You know that something belongs to KFC, something belongs to Apple, something belongs to Microsoft. We still use this system that was invented way back then, but in a completely different way. The Mesopotamians would start using this, and they'd use a cylindrical roll to create ownership. On the bottom, it would have a seal, and on the side, they would roll it across this clay, and it would show, leave out kind of this indented and reliefed image that would be used as a trademark to show who owned things. This is very apparent if you look in a lot of heraldry of the time. You'll see two lions engaged in combat that are lifting up their legs. This was something that, or even a seal or a crest for your family name. That's the same idea, that they wanted something that they could put or stamp on things that would show this family owns this person owns this, and it is not anyone's property, it is my property. So as we move along, we're going to talk about Egyptian hieroglyphs. So eventually moved out of this system of cuneiform and moved into using Egyptian hieroglyphs. Egyptian hieroglyphs completely got rid of cuneiform because it had 560 different symbols, which is crazy and hard to learn. And they created their own writing system called hieroglyphics. These were brief etchings and kind of glyphs and symbols that would be used to describe history or events that were happening. They were comprised of pictograms that depicted objects or beings. So they almost always represented what the thing was. Again, pictograms is a drawing of something that represents what it looks like. So this would be a pictogram of a bee. Right there. So as they started to have a need to convey more complex ideas, they started to use a system called rebus writing. Rebus writing uses pictures and represents sounds to kind of create words. So this whole square up here is an example of rebus writing. They would have a whole bunch of symbols and pictograms that would represent different sounds to create word. So maybe this would say b, and this would say a, and this would say t, and this would say h. So when we read it, it would say bath. And they created this system to where each symbol, much like our letters today, would represent a sound to create words. By the time they were finished, even though they were trying to simplify cuneiform and get rid of it, there were over 700 hieroglyphics in the system. A lot of times when you look at hieroglyphics, you'll see this kind of shape. A lot of hieroglyphics will be in this almost bullet shape. These bullets are called cartouche. It is Cartouche. And it represents a phrase. A lot of times they would use them for names of people. And as you can see, each small symbol in here would represent what would be a sound. And this is our kind of alphabet corresponding. So this would be a p, this would be a t sound. This is the O sound. And you'd see that they would spell out a name. So this is the name of Ptolemy. Down here is Cleopatra. And you always read hieroglyphics from the top to the bottom, and if it goes from left and right, then you will read from the direction that the living animals are facing. So if you see here, this jaguar here is facing left, so that means you start at the left and start at the top and read down. Here, you'll see that the cats, oh, it's the same jaguar. Jaguar is facing down here, so that means when you read, it's K, K, L, and then you go down, E, O. And so you'd always read in the direction that the living animals were facing. So as the Egyptians started to experiment with this kind of shorthand of writing on this papyrus kind of paper substance that they had created, they started to create these three different styles. There was the hieroglyphic that we had talked about before, and there was a hieratic script and a demotic script. Now these were kind of just a shorthand that made it easier for them to write whatever these symbols or ideas were. So at the top here is the hieroglyphic. This would be a sentence. So let's say that this sentence says, the boy brought the water to his family, and they sailed away into the sunset, and then the day ended. So this was a way of writing that in a very shorter kind of scribbled shorthand kind of way. It was quicker, it was more efficient, and it didn't take as many strokes or detailed illustrations. This was the hieratic script. So the demotic script became even more simple and almost became letters. It became very, very simple symbols that would mean certain sounds. They could piece together that this sentence and this sentence would mean the same thing. They would just be written in a different way. So this is the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was found, and it had Egyptian hieroglyphs, Egyptian demotic script, and Greek all on the same stone. What happened is this allowed for the hieroglyphs to become something that we could sound out instead of just being images and pictures. Before, we would see the pictograms of whatever the pictures were happening, and we weren't able to sound it out. We weren't able to produce a sound for each of those hieroglyphics. And the Rosetta Stone connected these three types of writing to show how it translated and then how we could translate it and sound it out to modern day. It made a visual language a verbal language. So it's something that you could see before, and now finally we would be able to speak it. The first three characters that were translated, you'll need to know this for your quiz. The first three characters that were translated were the P, the L, and the O. Those were the three letters that were kind of connected as they were trying to figure out how the three different scripts connected and worked together to really bring it to a place that we could understand. So Egyptians would also use this idea that we had talked about wanting a trademark. much like the Mesopotamians, but instead of having the rollers like we had looked at before, most of the Egyptians would have a scarab. A scarab was considered magical in their culture. It was a sign of good luck and kind of a mystical thing that you wanted to have with you. So a lot of times they'd be on rings, and on the backside would be that trademark. So they could press it into clay, they could put it onto a cypress piece of paper that they were working with, and it would leave this inscription that would be that you'd know this belonged to the pharaoh or this belongs to the chief of the armies, and it was very very often on that scarab. Uh, Both the idea of the cylindrical seals and the idea of ownership marks were passed down from the Sumerians, who came in and brought all that invention. So from the beginning of history, people needed a visual way to communicate ownership and to communicate who owned what and keep a written record of that that lasted. So we're going to keep looking at how this early written communication evolved into the written communication we have today of alphabets and especially our alphabet. And we're going to continue that next week in class. We'll be talking in person about chapter 2. Hope to see you then. And again, if you have any questions, just let me know, and I'd be happy to get back to you.